I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the chirping of birds, and the music rising from the spa park. I could make out the melody clearly, but it didn't bother me, because our ears have an incredible ability to adapt. They grow used to noise within minutes and tune it out. However, if there is a disruption in the rhythm of the noise, then we notice it, we perk up and listen. That's why, as I was immersed in my book, I suddenly realized that the music had stopped. I don't know what piece the spa orchestra was playing at that moment. I only heard the music cease abruptly. I raised my head from my book. Something had happened to the crowds wandering among the trees too. They had all suddenly stopped walking. I stood up, thinking something must have happened, and saw that the musicians were also leaving the area. It was in this scene that Stefan Zweig learned of the news that would change the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Just a few hours earlier, Franz Ferdinand had drawn his last breath in Sarajevo. 2 bullets had been enough to ignite a Europe already turned into a powder keg. Except for a handful of Black Hand members who had planned the assassination, no one realized that Saturday, June 27th, had been the last peaceful day for a very long time. The countdown to the apocalypse had begun. In May 1914, British diplomat Arthur Nicholson wrote in his diary, "Since I entered the Foreign Office, I've never seen the waters this calm." And Nicholson wasn't entirely wrong. Despite the arms race and the increasingly militaristic stance of some civilian and military leaders, the European international system had, as a whole, shown a surprising success in managing crises and preserving détente. So what happened that turned this climate into the Great War in 1914? In the summer of 1912, Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas met informally at a Baltic port, accompanied by their entourages of statesmen. The monarchs went on walks, dined together, and inspected troops. The statesmen held friendly, wide-ranging negotiations. It was here that Kokovtsov and Bethmann Hollweg met for the first time and quickly warmed to one another. Both prime ministers spoke about their country's armament policies and tried to convince the other that their efforts were purely defensive. The German Chancellor even held a similar conversation with Russian Foreign Minister Sazonov. Just months before the Balkan War broke out, Sazonov assured that Russia had completed its duty to the Christian Slavic states. He also claimed Russia had no intention of exploiting the Ottoman Empire's weaknesses. In truth, both sides were lying to each other with remarkable composure. Despite the cordial tone of the talks, no concrete steps were taken. Even though the negotiations produced no real results, they alarmed the other powers. London and Paris watched Tsar Nicholas with dread, while Vienna did the same with Kaiser Wilhelm. A potential Russo-German agreement could unravel all diplomatic calculations. But for Russia, especially, the path back from its alliances now seemed closed. In crises like Agadir, the Entente powers had managed to maintain unity. However, tensions on the continent had not eased enough to eliminate the possibility of war. Incidents like the Bosnian crisis, the Agadir incident, and the Balkan Wars had prompted states to increase their military preparations. Germany, meanwhile, found itself increasingly cornered. Despite various setbacks, Russia's economic growth and vitality alarmed Berlin. After his visit to Russia in the summer of 1912, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg was deeply shaken. Berlin had come to realize that time was no longer on its side. Since 1900, Russia's population had grown by 40 million. Compared to Germany's 65 million, Russia was nearing 200 million. Once its Great Program was complete in 1917 to 1918, Russia's peacetime army would number 2.2 million men, nearly triple the size of Germany's. Bethmann Hollweg was far from paranoid. Helmuth von Moltke, who succeeded Schlieffen as Chief of the General Staff in January 1906, also had a bleak view of Germany's strategic position. He believed that, in the long run, war between the two alliance blocs was inevitable. time was working against Germany. Its future enemies were growing stronger by the day, especially Russia, with its booming industry and seemingly endless manpower, was steadily building its military strength and would one day become irresistible. That would allow Russia to dictate the timing and terms of any future war. Berlin believed that this trajectory had to be stopped. If war was inevitable, it should not be postponed, because every year of delay only made Germany's enemies stronger. Franz Ferdinand, according to the Austrians, lacked the qualities necessary for popularity: politeness, affability, a charming appearance, and adherence to social norms. I often saw him at the theatre. He would sit in his box with his large frame, enormous belly, and cold, blank stare, never once casting a warm glance at the audience or applauding the performers enthusiastically to encourage them. He lacked any sense of music or humour, and his wife's expression was as cold and joyless as his. Franz Ferdinand was not the direct heir to the throne. When Crown Prince Rudolf, the son of Emperor Franz Joseph, committed suicide in 1889, a vacuum emerged within the Habsburg dynasty. This vacuum was initially filled by Franz Ferdinand's father, Archduke Karl Ludwig. Upon Ludwig's death in 1896, Franz Ferdinand became the new heir to the throne. Franz Joseph never liked him. He was irritable, stubborn, and uncompromising. But the real rupture came when Ferdinand decided to marry Sophie Chotek. Sophie came from noble stock, yes, but not noble enough for the Habsburg dynasty. She neither belonged to a dynasty tied to the Roman Empire, nor had direct blood ties to other European royal families. The principle of equal marriage, inherited from the Holy Roman Empire, prohibited such a union. When Emperor Franz Joseph heard about the engagement, he flew into a rage. Ferdinand's decision was not just a rebellion against family tradition, it was a challenge to the very order of the empire. Yet Ferdinand did not back down. Eventually, in 1899, Franz Joseph permitted the marriage on the condition that it be morganatic. Franz Ferdinand could marry Sophie, but she would hold no titles, privileges, or inheritance rights associated with the Habsburg family. Their children would not be considered heirs to the throne. At official ceremonies, Sophie's name was not mentioned, and she was pushed to the background in state protocols. The wife of the heir to the empire was treated almost like a servant. She was not allowed to ride in the royal carriage or sit in the imperial box at theatres. None of Franz Joseph's brothers or other archdukes attended the wedding. Franz Ferdinand, in turn, developed a brooding and angry withdrawal in response to this exclusion. He avoided court ceremonies and kept away from the palace, becoming known in Viennese high society as the man who renounced the throne. In 1906, the emperor appointed his nephew as Inspector General of the Army, a turning point in Franz Ferdinand's life. Years of isolation within the court had deprived him of political influence and personal freedom. This new role was a great opportunity for a man who loved to travel and could only freely spend time with his wife during such trips. It allowed him to increase his political presence while also escaping the passivity of court life in Vienna. Ferdinand began to carve out a sphere of influence within the state. In doing so, he crossed paths with a man who would play a major role in the march to war, Conrad von Hötzendorf. At the start of the 20th century, Conrad was one of the most notable high-ranking military figures in Europe. He was appointed Chief of the General Staff in 1906 and would go on to advocate fiercely for war against the monarchy's enemies. His approach to foreign affairs was extremely aggressive, yet he was also plagued by inner turmoil and depressive episodes. He frequently contemplated resignation. His tendency towards self-doubt intensified after the death of his wife in 1905 and was further exacerbated by his scandalous affair, which would come to shape the rest of his life. At a dinner, he fell in love with Gina von Reininghaus, the wife of a Viennese industrialist. This forbidden love became an obsession. He even came to see war as a means to possess Gina. He hoped that as a war hero, he could overcome the social barriers between them and survive the scandal of marrying a recently divorced woman. Conrad viewed the Habsburg monarchy's geopolitical dilemmas with the same obsessive rigidity he showed in love. His solution to nearly every diplomatic issue was war, a stance he maintained until the Great War. He repeatedly advocated for preemptive wars against Serbia, Montenegro, Russia, Romania, and even Italy. Of all these potential threats, Serbia consumed his thoughts the most. In a memorandum at the end of 1907, he recommended Serbia's invasion and annexation, describing it as a hotbed of conspiracy, constantly plotting to separate the South Slavs. During the height of the annexation crisis in 1908 to 1909, he again called for a preventive war against Belgrade. In spring 1909, he told his beloved Gina, "To sit idly by is a crime. A war with Serbia could have saved the monarchy. In a few years, we will bitterly regret not acting, and I will bear all the blame." Ironically, history would prove Conrad right. During the Balkan Wars, he again pushed for war with Serbia. Between January 1st, 1913 and January 1st, 1914, he called for war at least 25 times. But how did this fiery militarist and standard bearer of the pro-war faction rise to such a position? And more importantly, how did he remain in it? The answer, it turns out, was closely tied to his love life. Unlike Conrad, Archduke Ferdinand believed that the monarchy's structural weaknesses and its dire need for internal reform made an aggressive foreign policy impossible. He fiercely opposed war advocates like Conrad. Yet it was Ferdinand himself who had appointed Conrad to the position of Chief of the General Staff, bypassing many competent candidates. Why? Because Ferdinand liked him. Normally someone who rarely showed affection, the Archduke had a good relationship with Conrad, mainly because Conrad respected and admired Sophie Chotek. Ferdinand often judged people by how they treated his unconventional marriage. Conrad, himself entangled in a forbidden love affair, sympathized. But on matters of security and diplomacy, the two increasingly diverged. For Conrad, the army was merely a tool for war. He dedicated himself to preparing it for the next great conflict. For Ferdinand, however, the military was the guardian of internal stability. He was also opposed to the annexation of Bosnia. In August 1908, he said, "Given the deplorable state of our domestic affairs, I am fundamentally opposed to such power plays." He warned Foreign Minister Ehrenthal not to let the crisis end in war. It would gain us nothing, and those Balkan rascals might draw encouragement from Britain or even Italy and provoke us into a military move. He added that he didn't want such cheap victories to spark a European crisis and drag the empire into a war it cannot sustain on 2 or 3 fronts. As time passed, Conrad's relations with Ferdinand and Ehrenthal worsened. Ferdinand even instructed Ehrenthal to rein in Conrad. In December 1911, when Conrad suggested taking advantage of the Italo-Turkish War to attack Italy, it marked the end of the road. Due to his conflicts with Ehrenthal and his love affair, Conrad was dismissed in December 1911. He returned to office during the Balkan Wars after Ehrenthal's death, but he did not abandon his war policy. His biggest obstacle remained Franz Ferdinand. The heir worked harder than ever to neutralize Conrad's influence over other statesmen. During meetings held while the Balkan Wars raged, the two had numerous arguments. The Archduke made it clear, "I do not want war with Russia under any circumstances, and I don't want a single tree or a single sheep from Serbia." Their relationship continued to deteriorate. By autumn 1913, they were open enemies. When Conrad redeployed troops without consulting him, Ferdinand publicly rebuked him in front of senior officers. The end of Conrad's career seemed imminent. Though the intervention of senior figures briefly calmed the crisis, tensions flared again during the Bosnian summer maneuvers of 1914. Ferdinand now firmly resolved to be rid of his troublesome chief of staff. After the exercises, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Duchess Sophie departed on the journey that would change world history to Sarajevo. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie Cheque arrived by train in Sarajevo. From the Apple Quay, they boarded a car to go to the city hall. The motorcade consisted of 6 vehicles. In the first car rode Sarajevo's mayor, Fium Effendi Ucic, wearing a fez and a black suit, and police chief Dr. Edmund Gerde. The second car was a beautiful, open-top, 2-door Grafe and stiff sports car carrying the Archduke and his wife so they could be visible to the crowd lining the streets. The convoy travelled along the Apple Quay, which ran beside the river and into the heart of Sarajevo. After days of rain, sunlight bathed the city on that June morning, but the Austrians had chosen the worst possible day for the visit. It was Vidovdan, St. Vitus Day, the anniversary of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, when the Ottoman army had crushed the Serbian forces and ended the Serbian Empire in the Balkans, paving the way for Ottoman expansion. In 1914, this commemoration held special significance. It was the first St. Vitus Day to be celebrated since Kosovo had been liberated in the Second Balkan War the previous year. On June 28, 1914, the Black Hands newspaper Piemont wrote, "The fire of Kosovo, which has inspired us Serbs for generations, has now become a great blaze. Kosovo is now free. The revenge of Kosovo has been taken." For Serbian nationalists, the fact that the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had arrived in Sarajevo on such a symbolic day was a grave insult, and one that had to be answered. In the days leading up to the visit, 7 terrorists entered the city in 2 separate cells. On the morning of the Archduke's arrival, they took their positions at intervals along the riverside. Each carried bombs the size of a bar of soap equipped with 12-second fuses. To ensure the mission's success, additional men and materials were brought in. If one failed or was captured, another would complete the task. Each also carried cyanide to commit suicide rather than be caught alive. Although there had been intelligence suggesting a possible assassination attempt, the Archduke and his wife rode in an open-top car through a crowded route that had been publicly announced. Normally, troops would be stationed along such a route, but there were none. The convoy moved through the dense crowds without any significant security precautions. There weren't even any special police arrangements. By mistake, the chief of police had gotten into a car with 3 Bosnian officers, leaving the rest of his men behind at the train station. Franz Ferdinand had spent the past 3 days with Sophie in the quiet spa town of Ilidja, where they saw few people beyond familiar faces. At one point, they'd even visited the Sarajevo market unannounced and walked among the crowds. Among those watching them was a young Bosnian Serb, Gavrilo Princip, who would kill them 3 days later. The evening before they travelled to Sarajevo by train, Sophie had met with Bosnian Croat leader Dr. Josip Sunaric, who warned her that their visit was taking place at a time when Serbian national sentiments were at their peak. Sophie replied, "Dear Dr. Sunaric, you are so mistaken. Everywhere we've gone, even among the Serbs, we have been met with great love and sincerity, and we are so very happy about that." Franz Ferdinand was known for his impatience with security measures and wanted to complete this final part of the Bosnian tour with the ease of an ordinary civilian. He had spent the previous days inspecting military exercises in the surrounding hills and now wanted to mix with his future subjects as the heir to the Habsburg throne. Most importantly, June 28th was the couple's wedding anniversary. Sophie insisted on being with him for the occasion. The cars, decorated with black and yellow Habsburg flags and red and yellow Bosnian flags, passed houses and shops until they reached Muhammad Mehmed Bashic, who was waiting on Umarija Bridge. As the crowd cheered, Mehmed Bashic began preparing his bomb. It was a tense moment. Once the fuse was ignited, there would be no turning back. He pulled the bomb from the cloth in which it was wrapped. but froze in fear, thinking someone was approaching him. He failed to throw the bomb. The convoy moved on. The next one was Nedeljko Jabranović, positioned on the riverside. He drew his bomb and struck the fuse against a lamppost to ignite it, but missed his target. The bomb bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded behind it. Jabranović immediately swallowed his cyanide and jumped into the river, but the poison was poor quality. It burned his throat and stomach lining, but didn't kill or even knock him out. Since it was summer, the river was shallow, too shallow to drown or be swept away. He fell just 8 meters down onto the riverbank's gravel, where he was quickly apprehended by a local shopkeeper, an armed barber, and 2 policemen. Rather than evacuate immediately, Franz Ferdinand oversaw the treatment of the wounded and ordered the convoy to continue on to Sarajevo City Hall before later returning along the same route to visit the injured at the hospital. "Let's go," he said. That man must be mad. The convoy moved again. The trailing vehicles passed the smoldering wreck of the 4th car, giving the remaining assassins another opportunity. But the would-be killers were young and inexperienced. When the car and its passengers came into view, 3 of them lost their nerve. The youngest, Vaso Jubrilović, froze when he saw that Sophie was also in the car. He would later say, "I didn't pull my gun because the Duchess was there. I couldn't do it to her." Svietko Popovich likewise did nothing out of fear. He later admitted that when he saw the Archduke up close, he lost his courage. At first, it seemed Franz Ferdinand had been right to carry on with the program. The convoy reached City Hall without further incident. After the official reception, the plan was to travel from Franz Joseph Street to the National Museum. The Archduke asked Governor Potiorek if another attack was possible. Potiorek reportedly gave a disheartening answer. "I hope not, but even with the tightest security, it's hard to stop at such close range." He suggested cancelling the rest of the visit and returning directly to Ilija or going to the governor's residence, then to the train station on the river's left bank. But Franz Ferdinand wanted to visit the wounded in the hospital. The museum visit was cancelled, and the convoy was directed to continue along Apple Quay rather than retracing the original route through Franz Joseph Street, where further danger might still have been present. According to the original plan, Sophie was not supposed to accompany him at this point, but she took the initiative and told him in front of the entire entourage, "I'm going with you to the hospital." The motorcade headed west in the growing heat. But no one had informed the drivers that the route had changed. As they passed the market, the lead car turned into Franz Joseph Street, so the driver of Franz Ferdinand's vehicle followed. Potiorek shouted, "You're going the wrong way! We were supposed to go along Apple Quay." The driver stopped the car, and since there was no reverse gear, it was slowly pushed back onto the main road. This was Gavrilo Princip's moment. He was standing in front of a shop on the right side of Franz Joseph Street and saw the car slow down and stop. He couldn't retrieve his bomb, so he drew his pistol. Under the terrified gaze of Count Harak, fired 2 shots at close range. At first, it seemed he had missed. The Archduke and Duchess remained seated. But in truth, both were dying. The first bullet pierced the car door and struck Sophie in the abdomen, severing her stomach artery. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck, shattering his jugular vein. As the car drove along the river toward the governor's residence, Sophie slumped and fell with her face onto her husband's lap. Franz Ferdinand's faint voice could be heard words that would become famous throughout the empire. "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." His green ostrich-plumed helmet fell from his head. When Harak asked if he was in pain, he whispered several times, "It's nothing." Then he lost consciousness. As the car drove away, the crowd swarmed around Gavrilo Princip. He tried to shoot himself in the temple, but the gun was knocked from his hand. He also failed to swallow his cyanide. By the time they reached the governor's residence, Sophie was already dead. Franz Ferdinand was in a coma. It took several more minutes for those in the room to accept that the heir to the throne had died. It was exactly 11 a.m. As the news spread from the residence, church bells began to ring across Sarajevo. While these events unfolded in Sarajevo, Emperor Franz Joseph, ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for 66 years, was at his summer residence, Kaiser Villa, as he often was during the warmer months. It was here that he received the news of his nephew and Sophie's death. Ein höheres Wesen hat die Ordnung wiederhergestellt, die ich leider nicht mehr aufrechterhalten konnte. A higher power has restored the order, which I, unfortunately, could no longer maintain. That same afternoon, Kaiser Wilhelm was occupied preparing his yacht Meteor for the Kiel Regatta on Germany's North Sea coast. As the race neared, a small boat, Hulda, approached and honked its horn. Focused on finishing the race, the Kaiser signaled the boat to change course. But Admiral von Müller, aboard the approaching vessel, insisted with a gesture that he had an urgent message. He then tossed a cigarette case, containing the message, onto the yacht's deck. Wilhelm opened the case and read the shocking news from Sarajevo. His face went pale. Just 1 week earlier, he had visited his friend Franz Ferdinand at the Konopist. Now he learned that the Archduke had been murdered. Although Franz Ferdinand got along with very few people, Wilhelm had shown a particular fondness for him. That affection stemmed partly from Emperor Franz Joseph's advanced age and the fact that Franz Ferdinand was expected to take his place soon. Only days earlier, the two men had discussed stabilizing the Balkans talks, which now seemed like a bitter memory. Wilhelm's only trusted contact in the region was gone. He immediately returned to Berlin, where he would play a pivotal role in the events to come. At the same time in France, President Raymond Poincaré was at the Longchamp racecourse in Paris, watching the Grand Prix with other diplomats when he received the news via telegram. In Italy, the deaths of the Archduke and his wife were met with mixed feelings. Franz Ferdinand had been as hostile to Italians in the Empire as he was to Hungarians. Despite the official condolences, Britain's ambassador to Rome, Rennell Rodd, noted, "The people, by and large, viewed the Archduke's death as practically a gift from God. The assassination stunned the world, but few realized it would lead to apocalypse." Italy's foreign minister, San Giuliano, echoed this common misjudgment when he told the Russian ambassador Sverbiev, "The crime is terrible, but it will not harm world peace." In the aftermath, governments began holding meetings to define their positions on the unfolding situation. Within days, Austro-Hungarian Joint Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold came under immense pressure. Since replacing Arenthal in 1912, Berchtold had pursued a cautious, moderate foreign policy. But this event would stretch even his limits. The hawkish faction immediately called for war against Serbia to teach the Serbs, who had troubled them for years, a definitive lesson. Conrad von Hötzendorf, leader of the war party, would criticize Berchtold for his hesitation during the Balkan Wars, blaming the caution for their current predicament. Even Berchtold, once the diplomat of maneuver and restraint, now leaned toward war. On June 30th, at Schönbrunn Palace, Berchtold met with Emperor Franz Joseph for the first time since the assassination. Berchtold said the empire's policy of patience had run its course. The emperor agreed. Berchtold warned that if Austria-Hungary showed weakness, even in such an extreme case, its southern and eastern neighbors would be emboldened to press their demands with even greater determination. The empire was now fully hemmed in. Franz Joseph shared his minister's view that it was time to act. But there was a major complication. A decision as momentous as war required the approval of both halves of the dual monarchy. Franz Joseph instructed Berchtold to keep the Hungarian Prime Minister, Count István Tissa, informed at every step. But this was where the real problem began. Tissa was openly opposed to war. In a letter to the emperor the following day, Tissa cautioned against allowing the assassination to become a justification for taking steps that could lead to conflict with Serbia. Hungarian concerns centered on Romania. Now drawing closer to Russia, Romania had its eyes on Transylvania and its ethnic Romanian population. Tissa argued that Austria-Hungary should not go to war with Serbia until Romania's loyalty was secured and the risk of a broader conflict was eliminated. He offered two options: either convince the Romanians with Berlin's help to join the Triple Alliance, or prevent them from reconciling with Bulgaria, their former enemy from the Second Balkan War. Vienna had many crises to solve. Meanwhile, in Russia, the situation was seen quite differently. From the Russian perspective, a crime committed by individuals, especially inexperienced anarchists, did not grant Austria the right to attack Serbia. Russia maintained that Serbia had nothing to do with the heinous act, and the other Entente powers had no reason to believe otherwise. The French government had already delegated full authority to St. Petersburg in any Austria-Serbia conflict. Without even investigating the matter, Poincaré dismissed any connection between Belgrade and the assassination. Britain would not take a markedly different position. Edward Grey said, "I said I did not know what lay behind the incident. At the trial of those who killed the Archduke, it might emerge that the bombs came from Belgrade. This might place the Serbian government under suspicion, but it would be mere speculation." Count Benkendorf hoped that Germany would restrain Austria. He did not want to believe that Berlin would welcome a conflict. This point was critical. Britain was placing the burden of peace on Germany, expecting it to restrain its ally. If it did not, war among the great powers was seen as inevitable. Foreign Secretary Edward Grey said he did not believe Austria would be so foolish as to rush into war. Neither London nor Paris intended to challenge Russia's version of events. According to the Entente, an unpopular warmongering tyrant had been killed by members of a nation driven to desperation after years of mistreatment and humiliation. Now, the rotting regime that this tyrant represented, a regime on the verge of collapse, was trying to lay the blame on its innocent and peaceful Slavic neighbor. This stance by the Entente powers would lay the foundation for Russia to come to the aid of its innocent brothers in the event of war. The steps toward the worst-case scenario were now being taken, one by one. What happened in Sarajevo would not only provoke the warmongers in Vienna, but would also completely extinguish the faint hope for peace that still existed in the long-strained relations between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Vienna had adopted an almost unanimously pro-war stance, but the matter could not be resolved merely through discussions at the table. It soon became clear that an immediate military intervention, as some advocated, was impossible. First, Tissa, the Hungarian side of the dual monarchy, had to be persuaded. Within the dual system, it was politically and constitutionally impossible to disregard Tissa. Moreover, Serbia's involvement in the crime had to be proven. On the afternoon of June 30th, in a meeting with Berchtold, Tissa stated that the Serbian government should be given time to demonstrate its goodwill. Another sensitive matter was determining the best moment for the army to act. Conrad favored striking at once, but even he told Berchtold on the morning of June 30th that the general staff would need 16 days to mobilize the army. Given the cumbersome nature of Austria's military apparatus, this estimate would prove overly optimistic. Above all, Austria's greatest concern was Germany's stance. Would Berlin agree to a declaration of war against Serbia? On July 1st, in a report submitted to Emperor Franz Joseph, Tissa warned that the German emperor harbored a pro-Serb prejudice and stressed that he must be convinced to support Vienna's Balkan policy. When Wilhelm II came to Vienna for the Archduke's funeral, Austrian statesmen hoped that the two emperors would meet face-to-face and exchange views. However, the visit was cancelled due to intelligence suggesting that there was also a plot to assassinate the German emperor. Other means would be needed to ensure coordinated policy with Berlin. At least on one point Berchtold, Tissa and the other statesmen agreed. Before taking action, Germany's consent must be secured. Around this time, secret contacts began between the two sides. A German journalist close to the government got in touch with Count Alexander Hoyos, private secretary to Austrian Foreign Minister Berchtold. Hoyos had been chosen for these unofficial talks for a reason. During the Bosnian annexation crisis, he had been sent to Berlin to secure Germany's support, and he was known as a representative of the hawkish faction. The Germans were well aware of this. After an initially measured dialogue, the two men spoke openly and agreed on the need to punish Serbia. The real test would be whether Russia intended to fight. Journalist Victor Naumann believed the Kaiser could be persuaded. If one speaks to Kaiser Wilhelm in the right way at this moment, when he has just experienced the horror of the Sarajevo murder, he will give us every assurance, and because he understands the dangers threatening the principle of monarchy, this time he will go as far as war. In other words, if the Austrians presented their case while the Kaiser was still angry over his friend's murder, he would agree to war with Serbia. A further development played into the hands of the Central Powers. After the assassination, Gavrilo Princip, once in custody, initially denied any connection to a wider conspiracy. But the next day, during interrogation, another member of the group, Jabranovic, admitted he was friends with Princip. He denied the existence of an organized plot at first, but under pressure he confessed. He tried to convince the authorities that only the two of them were involved, but the decisive confession came from another captured conspirator, the plot's organizer, Danilo Ilic. To save his life, on Wednesday, July 1st, he revealed the names of the other three conspirators. Princip himself gave in on Thursday, July 2nd, urging the others to tell the authorities what they knew, claiming there were many victims and that they should speak up. While Princip took responsibility and tried to get the others to repeat the same story, he hoped to prevent the Austrian investigation from reaching Belgrade. But of course, the investigation continued in full. These confessions strengthened the hand of Vienna's leaders. In the first week of July, the discussion in Vienna turned to how the memorandum for official contact with Berlin should be delivered. If sent by post, the Germans might not take it seriously enough. If delivered by Foreign Minister Berchtold himself, other states might realize Austria was preparing something. If entrusted to the 73-year-old Hungarian-born ambassador in Berlin, Szygényi, it might not have the desired impact. The most suitable choice for Vienna was Count Hoyos, who had made unofficial contact with the Germans just days earlier. Choosing Hoyos would leave no doubt in Berlin about Vienna's intentions. A staunch hawk, he would make Austria's demands crystal clear. Events moved quickly. On the afternoon of July 4th, the decision was made, and Count Hoyos departed that very night. Arriving in Berlin on July 5th, the diplomat immediately informed Ambassador Szygényi that the time had come for a final reckoning with Serbia. Because of Tisza's opposition to war, the note avoided mentioning war explicitly, instead stating that Serbia must be eliminated as a political factor in the Balkans. Vienna wanted to know Berlin's position on such a scenario. Exactly 7 days after the assassination, on Sunday, July 5th, the note was delivered to Kaiser Wilhelm. The Kaiser, who had often been burned by impulsiveness, told Szygényi he could not give a definitive answer without first consulting Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. Normally, the meeting would have ended there, but Wilhelm, once again succumbing to his impulsive nature, expressed his support for the note. Action against Serbia must not be delayed. Russia's attitude would undoubtedly be hostile, but we have been prepared for that for years, and when war between Austria-Hungary and Russia becomes inevitable, we can be certain that our old loyal ally Germany will stand at our side. Russia is in no way ready for war at present and would have to think twice before taking up arms. After this meeting, Wilhelm summoned every senior official he could find in Berlin to his office. Among those present were General Hans von Plessen, head of the military cabinet General Moritz von Linke, and War Minister General Erich von Falkenhayn. At the opening of the meeting, the Kaiser read aloud the diplomatic notes presented to him by Cheque and briefly summarized his conversation with the ambassador. He then opened the floor for discussion. Many in the room understood that what was being implied was war. Falkenhayn, however, was not entirely convinced. In his report to the Chief of the General Staff, Moltke, who was undergoing spa treatment in Carlsbad, Falkenhayn wrote that it was difficult to discern exactly what the Austrians were aiming for. The War Minister concluded that the note did not explicitly demand war and shared this view with Moltke. In reality, both Count Hoyos and Cheque had indeed hinted at war to the Kaiser, and Wilhelm had expressed support for this view. But when pressed to lay out the reasoning for such a decision, the Kaiser resorted to vague language. In particular, Falkenhayn and Bethmann Hollweg could not arrive at a definite conclusion regarding the true intent of the Kaiser in the note. Both believed the Austrians were speaking in empty phrases. Hoyos' trip to Berlin was, in fact, meant to dispel this uncertainty. The Austrians wanted to underline their war aims beyond any doubt. In a meeting with his counterpart Arthur Zimmermann, Hoyos agreed on the idea of a preventive war. He went a step further, revealing Austria's plan for an unprepared strike against Serbia, after which Serbian territory would be divided among Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Albania. Zimmermann merely smiled at this statement and raised no objections. Although the two men agreed in principle, they were not the decision-makers. The ultimate decision would rest with the Kaiser and Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. But Hollweg was a figure distrusted by the hawkish faction. His attempts at rapprochement with Britain had not been well received by the advocates of war, who among themselves referred to the cautious Chancellor and the apprehensive monarch as two old women. The British, too, saw Hollweg as the spokesman for peace in Berlin, and he was not particularly popular within the army. Wilhelm, however, had known Bethmann since childhood and liked and trusted him. Even at the best of times a pessimist by temperament, Bethmann in July was in deeper gloom than usual. His depressive personality was balanced by his beloved wife Martha, who had sadly left him in May. The loss was devastating. Now he suffered from insomnia, was gaining weight, and was generally anxious. The Chancellor, who had planned to spend the summer on holiday in the countryside, saw his hopes dashed by the Sarajevo affair. Returning to the capital, Bethmann arrived at the meeting with the Kaiser at the last moment and had not fully grasped the seriousness of the situation. The talks on Sunday, July 5th, did not go well for him. It was only the next day, when he received Count Hoyos, Ambassador Cheque, and Zimmermann, that the Chancellor realized the depth of Austrian seriousness. Going through a transformative period in his life, Bethmann Hollweg, for once stepping outside his usual cautious stance, would act according to Austrian wishes. In regard to our relations with Serbia, the German government believes that we should not decide what to do on our own. Whatever we decide, we can absolutely count on Germany standing by us as our ally. Like the Kaiser, the Chancellor believes that immediate action against Serbia offers the most suitable and decisive solution to our difficulties in the Balkans. He also considers the present moment more favorable than any later date. The German government was speaking with one voice, as soon as possible, at the earliest possible moment, without delay. German statesmen were telling different people the same thing, treating Austria's rapid intervention almost as a precondition. This was a critical turning point. For the first time, the argument that Helmut von Moltke and Conrad von Hötzendorf had been making for years was also being championed by Bethmann Hollweg. But the most crucial point was that the German government promised Austria-Hungary full support, essentially a blank check. This decision, taken without serious opposition and without a detailed risk assessment, amounted to crossing the Rubicon. The first move that would set in motion an irreversible crisis came, through miscalculation, from Germany. At the Potsdam meeting on July 5th, everyone around the Kaiser believed that, despite being Serbia's friend, Russia would not go to war. This is why, at the same meeting, when War Minister Falkenhayn asked the Kaiser whether he wanted preparations made in case of a major war between the great powers, Wilhelm replied in the negative. The Germans believed that while supporting Vienna, they could keep the war within limits. On July 6th, the day Bethmann Hollweg approved Austria's course, the Kaiser told Navy Minister Admiral von Kappel that the Tsar would not agree to side with the murderers, that therefore there was no risk of the military conflict spreading, and that neither France nor Russia was ready for war. In fact, Wilhelm believed that Russia was not prepared for any serious war. In late 1913, in the aftermath of the Albanian crisis, he had told Ambassador Shoghieni that Russia does not trouble me for the moment, and for the next 6 years there will be no point in fearing them. But Wilhelm and the Germans, and indeed the Austrians, were deeply mistaken. They failed to understand how important any potential Austro-Serbian war had become for the Franco-Russian alliance. They did not grasp that neither state would pay much attention to the question of who started the conflict. Most importantly, as they gave Austria a blank check along with their advice, there was another truth the Germans did not know, but would learn in the most bitter way. Istvan Tissa. On the afternoon of Sunday, July 5th, Austro-Hungarian Chief of the General Staff Conrad von Hötzendorf was at Schönbrunn Palace arguing the necessity of war. In his view, Emperor Franz Joseph had now reached the point of accepting that a war with Serbia was inevitable. The emperor asked, "But if everyone, especially Russia, turns against us, how will you conduct this war?" Conrad replied with a question of his own. "Do we have Germany's support behind us?" Franz Joseph evasively answered that he was not sure and was awaiting a reply regarding the note sent to Berlin. "If Germany stands with us, will we declare war on Serbia?" Conrad pressed. "In that case, yes," the emperor answered. That same day, the military governor of Bosnia, Oskar Potiorek, would obtain crucial information from the interrogation of Danilo Ilic. He managed to extract a confession that Major Tankasic, an officer close to Apis, had trained the assassins. This admission was vital for Vienna, as it would make it much harder for Tissa, the most serious opponent of war, to maintain his stance against conflict with Serbia. On July 6th, Vienna again became the scene of important meetings. Hötzendorf met with Foreign Minister Berchtold. Unaware of the emperor's stance, Berchtold was informed of it for the first time by Hötzendorf. If German support was secured, there would certainly be a war with Serbia. While every official institution in Vienna was alive with activity, on the morning of Tuesday, July 7th, Count Oyos returned from Germany. Going straight to the Ballhausplatz, the foreign ministry, Oyos confirmed the accuracy of the positive reports from Berlin. He also relayed to Conrad and Berchtold the pro-war conversation he had had with Zimmermann, making it clear he had returned from Berlin with exactly what he had wanted. "Even if our operations against Serbia lead to a major war, Germany will stand firmly at our side. It advises us to strike immediately." The pace of events in Vienna quickened by the hour. As soon as he received the news, Hötzendorf went straight to the military headquarters. His first telegram was sent to Archduke Friedrich, expected to assume command of the Austro-Hungarian army in wartime following Franz Ferdinand's death. He instructed the Archduke to cancel his trip to Hamburg and await urgent developments. Hötzendorf had now taken the wheel and begun preparations to ready the army. Berchtold likewise threw himself into work, deliberately kept out of the German talks. Tissa convened a meeting with German ambassador Heinrich von Tschirschky and Austrian Prime Minister Count Sturck. In this meeting, Count Oyos first read aloud 2 telegrams Shoghieni had sent from Berlin, then repeated to Berchtold what he had told him earlier about his discussion with Zimmermann. He laid out the entire scenario, nothing withheld, of a sudden strike on Belgrade and the partition of Serbian territory. Tissa was genuinely horrified by what he heard. The Hungarian leader, who had been working to restrain even the notion of a preventive war, now found himself staring at what seemed like a war of annexation. He quickly insisted to those present that the annexation plans and the conversation with Zimmermann represented personal views, and that this could not be a war to divide Serbia. Yet, In the afternoon cabinet meeting, the balance tipped decisively against him. Everyone except Tissa had moved into the pro-war camp. Berchtold opened the meeting by briefing those unaware about Hoyos's secret mission to Berlin. He explained that the talks with Germany had yielded an extremely satisfactory result, and that both Kaiser Wilhelm and Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg had solemnly promised unconditional German support in the event of complications leading to war with Serbia. According to Berchtold, the German government was fully aware that an armed clash with Serbia could lead to war with Russia. Despite the risks, he argued, showing weakness in the present crisis would be disastrous. Only a timely reckoning with Serbia could prevent the collapse of the dual monarchy. Faced with the prevailing mood among the leadership, Tissa struck a diplomatic tone, saying he now saw the possibility of military action against Serbia as less remote, but he was still determined to play all his cards. In his view, an attack without sufficient diplomatic justification would turn all of the Balkans, except Bulgaria, against Austria. After the Second Balkan War, exhausted Bulgaria could offer little real help on the battlefield. Opportunistic Romania would certainly side with Serbia, and most likely Russia would as well. Austria-Hungary would then be facing a three-front war. For this reason, Tissa insisted that all diplomatic avenues be exhausted. His first step was to propose that the dual monarchy prepare specific demands to be presented to Serbia. If these were rejected, an ultimatum could then be issued containing the threat of armed intervention. Should Belgrade accept the demands, Tissa argued, Austria would score a major diplomatic success and its prestige in the Balkans would rise. If the Serbs refused, then Tissa would accept military action. Thus began the opposition that would change the course of events. Tissa stood firmly against the swift war favoured by Germany and desired by Austria. He was not saying no to war, but with a two-stage ultimatum scenario, he was almost eliminating the chance of catching Serbia and Russia unprepared. At the meeting, Austrian statesmen tried to refute Tissa's arguments one by one. They warned that an ambiguous policy could result in the loss of Germany's support. To them, even the best diplomatic victory was worthless. The opportunity to solve the problem during the Balkan War had already been missed. After all, had the Japanese declared war before attacking Russia in 1904, Austria should use the element of surprise rather than telegraphing its intentions to everyone. All of this sounded perfectly logical. But by trying to dismantle the Hungarian Prime Minister's arguments, the other ministers had, without realizing it, conceded the debate's framework to him. Unlike the statesman who strayed from the core issue, Tissa kept opposing on the same point. And, incredibly, this resistance would succeed. The meeting minutes would record. He is ready to accept the view that mobilization should not be initiated until concrete demands have been communicated to Serbia and, in the event of their rejection, an ultimatum is issued. Berchtold would close the contentious meeting with these words. Although differences remain between Count Tissa and the others, we are now closer together, since the Hungarian Prime Minister's proposals will in all likelihood still lead to a declaration of war against Serbia. Anxiety-filled days awaited Berchtold. The Hungarian side had blocked any quick initiative, while German statesmen were pressing him on the need to act swiftly. On Wednesday, July 8th, German Ambassador Cheque went to see Berchtold to learn the outcome of the recent meeting. Dissatisfied with what he heard, the ambassador told Berchtold that Berlin expects action to be taken against Serbia, and it is impossible to overstate how incomprehensible Germany would find it if this opportunity were missed without delivering a blow. In fact, Austria had, without realizing it, brought about such a delay itself. The Austro-Hungarian army had recently granted a summer harvest leave for soldiers from rural areas, creating a natural obstacle to the desired rapid war. Chief of the General Staff Conrad von Hötzendorf had reluctantly approved the decision in order to placate powerful landowners in the dual monarchy. When Conrad returned to military headquarters, he discovered that 7 of the 16 Army Corps had only just been granted harvest leave. Most of these soldiers would return from leave between July 19th and 25. Cancelling the leave would completely reveal Austria's intentions. Therefore, the army could not be fully mobilized for at least 2 more weeks. The war party's hands were effectively tied. Tija's opposition, combined with the harvest leave, pushed Hötzendorf and Berchtold toward a decision. The ultimatum could not be sent before July 22nd. In this way, Austria-Hungary would lose precious days one by one, while the wave of outrage and the moral high ground generated worldwide by Franz Ferdinand's assassination would gradually fade. There was another problem for the Austrians. On July 15th, French President Poincaré and Prime Minister Viviani were set to depart for Russia on a long-planned visit. After an expected 5-day sea journey, the French delegation would arrive in Petersburg on July 20th. From this perspective, the July 22nd plan was fraught with danger. Poincaré and Tsar Nicholas could be raising glasses together when they learned of the ultimatum and could easily and amicably coordinate plans. Thus, July 22nd was a highly risky date. Bearing this in mind, Berchtold tried to ignore the harvest leave issue and launched a counter-initiative. His idea was to present the ultimatum on July 15th, just as the French began their 5-day voyage, so that the diplomatic crisis would begin and end before the Entente powers could meet. But this clever plan, too, ran into the Tissa obstacle. At the July 7th meeting, Tissa had made his signature on the ultimatum text a condition. While he did not reject Berchtold's proposal outright, he stalled it, informing the foreign minister that the ultimatum would have to be discussed and approved by a full cabinet. The earliest such meeting could take place was Sunday, July 19th. Even if the ultimatum were delivered on the 19th, Poincaré would reach St. Petersburg just a few hours later. Berchtold had no desire to present the ultimatum in a political climate that would foster a French-Russian show of unity. Thus, that plan too was scrapped, and Vienna approved the decision to deliver the ultimatum immediately after the French departed St. Petersburg. Only one task now remained: prepare the ultimatum, complete the necessary arrangements, and above all, keep mouths shut. But Austria would commit an astonishing blunder at the most critical moment. The efforts to keep the ultimatum secret were extensive. Many senior officials had left Vienna. According to reports he sent back to Russia, even Nikolai Shebeko, the Russian ambassador in Vienna, had been deceived by the ruse. Berchtold had instructed diplomats to avoid any discussion of the Sarajevo incident. Still, some form of response from the dual monarchy was expected, and Vienna was teeming with spies and informants seeking to learn Berchtold's intentions. A single leak to an enemy embassy could allow France and Russia to coordinate their response during the Petersburg summit, ruining Berchtold's plans. This entire policy of secrecy collapsed quickly due to a leak originating in Berlin. On July 11th, German Foreign Minister Gottlieb von Jagow mentioned Austria's intentions to the German envoy in Rome. The envoy raised the subject in a conversation with Italian Foreign Minister San Giuliano. San Giuliano immediately sent word to his embassies in St. Petersburg, Bucharest, and Vienna. The Austrians, who had cracked Italy's cipher and closely monitored the information flow between Vienna and Rome, discovered that the Italians had learned of Austria's plans from the Germans and relayed the information to 2 rival capitals. The Italian aim was to prompt Russia and Romania to intervene, thus preventing Vienna from taking any action. But an even greater leak would come from the most unexpected source. Berchtold himself, who had warned everyone, sent Hötzendorf and Krobotin on holiday as a precaution, and ordered all diplomats to stay silent would make the fatal mistake. On Monday, July 13th, he invited an old friend, Count Heinrich von Lützow, for a meeting. Berchtold regarded the 62-year-old Lützow, who served as Austria-Hungary's ambassador to Italy until 1910 before taking early retirement, as a wise man whose counsel he valued. To his old friend, Berchtold revealed his plans towards Serbia. Upon hearing them, Lützow warned that the idea of limiting a conflict with Serbia to the region was a fantasy. Disturbed by what he had learned, he decided to tell others. One of the retired diplomat's closest neighbours and frequent dining companions was Sir Maurice de Bunsen, the British ambassador in Vienna. At lunch on Wednesday, Lützow warned his friend that the dual monarchy can no longer tolerate Serbian insolence. A note is being prepared. It will be completed when the Sarajevo investigation is concluded. No futile negotiations will be tolerated. Should Serbia refuse to yield, force will be used to compel it. Shocked by what he heard, de Bunsen immediately returned to Vienna and informed Edward Grey of the note. Interestingly, Grey did not share the news with the Russians, but Berchtold would pay dearly for his loose tongue nonetheless. The next day, de Bunsen told Russian ambassador Nikolai Shebeko about the note. Shebeko promptly relayed the information to Sazonov in Russia. Now the Russians knew much of the game. On top of that, Berchtold made yet another blunder. Vienna sent a direct telegram to the Austro-Hungarian embassy in St. Petersburg asking when Poincaré would be leaving the city after his summit with the Tsar. The telegram, which sounded almost like confirmation of the rumors Russia had already heard, was intercepted by cryptologists, who quickly passed the news to Sazonov. Now a new act was opening in the drama leading to catastrophe. Everyone knew everything, yet behaved as if they knew nothing. The stage was set for the final performance before the guns began to fire. A true apocalypse now lies at a measurable or foreseeable distance before us, and compared to it the Ulster question becomes utterly insignificant. I am pleased to say that I see no reason why we cannot simply remain spectators. Sazonov's private secretary, Baron Moritz Schilling, learned on Friday, July 17th, from encrypted messages sent from Vienna about the timing of Poincaré's departure from St. Petersburg. On top of that, Vienna's ambassador in St. Petersburg, Count Shapari, requested an urgent meeting with Sazonov. On July 18th, when he met Sazonov, the ambassador's aim was to probe whether the Russians had caught wind of the ultimatum scheme. Yet Sazonov was the sort of diplomat who could sense such a game. Shapari tried not to let anything slip, while Sazonov, in turn, made sure not to reveal that he had already grasped the plot. The meeting played out like a chess match, with Sazonov giving nothing away. Thus, the Austrians continued to believe they had deceived their adversaries. The next day, on Sunday morning, Sazonov went to the Peterhof Palace to brief the Tsar on the unfolding crisis. He had the text of Ambassador Shebeko's July 16th telegram read aloud, warning that Vienna was preparing some kind of ultimatum for Belgrade. After speaking with Sazonov, the Tsar wrote a note in the margin of the telegram. In my opinion, a state should not impose demands of any kind upon another if it does not intend war. While the Tsar was learning of the ultimatum affair in Vienna, Berchtold was convening the Council of Ministers to finalize the conditions of the ultimatum to Serbia. By Sunday morning, Austria, as far as the world knew, had revealed nothing. The Tissa crisis, which had consumed precious days, had finally been overcome, and the imperial government now stood united behind the text of a 48-hour ultimatum. Vienna, with all eyes fixed upon it, sought to avoid drawing attention. To arouse no suspicion, the ministers arrived in unmarked cars. The top secret war council at the Ballhausplatz residence began at 10 in the morning. Presiding over the meeting, Berchtold laid out the basic timetable. The 48-hour ultimatum was to be dispatched on Thursday, July 23rd, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, just as Poincaré was about to depart St. Petersburg. Since Serbia was expected to reject it, The expiration of the ultimatum on Saturday at the same hour would allow mobilization to begin during the night of July 25th. To preempt objections over timing, Berchtold made it clear that German impatience left no room for further delay, a message aimed squarely at Tissa. Conrad von Hotzendorf not only approved of the decision, but pressed for the mobilization process to advance without delay. War Minister Krobatin reported that mobilization orders would be ready by Wednesday, July 22nd. Yet Tissa's doubts remained acute. To him, the gravest danger in the event of war was a Romanian attack through the Transylvanian Alps. Before giving final approval to the ultimatum plan, he demanded an explanation from Conrad about what was being done to defend Transylvania. Conrad, anticipating this very question, had his answer ready. Once mobilization began, martial law would be declared in Transylvania, and under the command of active duty officers, an expanded militia force would be raised against any potential Russian or Romanian attack. Even so, Tissa remained unconvinced, resisting on various grounds. But the path of political maneuver was closing for him as well. His resistance broken, Tissa gave his assent, and the ultimatum decision was carried unanimously. As the ultimatum was approved in Vienna, Poincaré was nearing St. Petersburg. On Monday, July 20th, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the French delegation arrived aboard the warship France and dropped anchor at Kronstadt. President Raymond Poincaré and Prime Minister René Viviani were welcomed with great ceremony. Before the delegation even disembarked, Poincaré met Tsar Nicholas II on the deck of the imperial yacht Alexandria in the Baltic. From the very first moments, Poincaré stressed the importance of the alliance. He declared that not only Franco-Russian cooperation, but also the Entente with Britain must now be solidified into a firm alliance. The Tsar agreed, emphasizing that the continuation of France's 3-year law was essential for the balance of power in Europe. Even before the formal talks began, the two leaders had set the tone. Both were of one mind in standing against Germany. Later that afternoon, at 4 o'clock, the French delegation attended a court reception for the diplomatic corps. Present in the front ranks were the German and Austro-Hungarian ambassadors. In the opening moments, the British ambassador, Sir George Buchanan, committed a major blunder. He had heard from Sazonov that Austria's ultimatum to Serbia was expected on Saturday. He had also learned from Serbia's envoy in St. Petersburg that Austria was seeking a pretext for war. Combining these fragments, Buchanan sketched a grim picture for Poincaré, telling him that the Serbian minister had informed him Austria might deliver a harsh note to Belgrade. The French, however, knew almost nothing of the developing ultimatum affair. Neither Britain nor Russia had kept them informed. Deeply angered by what he heard, Poincaré, having been unsettled by Buchanan's warnings about Austria's designs, then received Count Friedrich Schapari, the Habsburg ambassador. Hoping to extract information from Berchtold's man in Petersburg, he asked bluntly, without hesitation, "Have you had any news from Serbia?" Schapari replied coldly, "The judicial inquiry is proceeding." When the president warned him about the tensions in the Balkans, Schapari once again gave a curt reply. "Mr. President, we cannot tolerate a foreign state closing its eyes to preparations for attacks against our sovereignty carried out on its own soil." Poincaré's tone grew increasingly menacing. In the present state of general feeling in Europe, every state must exercise double the caution. Serbia has in Russia some of the most ardent of friends, and Russia, like France, is bound by alliance. There are difficulties here whose gravity is greatly to be feared. The two men concluded their exchange with all the finesse of diplomatic art. I was not pleased with this conversation. The ambassador has clearly been instructed to say nothing. Austria is preparing a coup de théâtre for us. Sazonov must stand firm, and we must back him. Poincaré immediately recounted the meeting to Foreign Minister Sazonov. Already well aware of the situation, Sazonov was now furious. Not wishing to provoke an open diplomatic rupture, he refrained from clashing head-on with Schipari and instead vented his anger on the German ambassador. He began his meeting with Count Portales in harsh tones, reminding him of Russia's view of the Sarajevo assassination. For Russia, this had been the deed of a few individuals, and it was impossible to hold an entire state responsible. In Sazonov's view, the winds of Greater Serbia, blowing in Belgrade, were Austria's own fault, born of its misrule. Portales responded with as much caution as possible, trying to calm the minister. But it was in vain. The Russian minister went so far as to threaten the German ambassador outright. If Austria-Hungary is determined to disturb the peace, it must understand that this time it will have to reckon with Europe. A few days later, when Kaiser Wilhelm read the report of this conversation, he scribbled in the margin, "No with Europe, but yes with Russia." The ambassador, however, had gone even further in his report, according to Sazonov. If Austria-Hungary adopted threatening language towards Serbia or resorted to military measures, Russia would never tolerate it. To drive the message home, he added yet another warning. Whatever happens, no talk of an ultimatum must be allowed. With these words, Russia's foreign minister had drawn a line in the sand, challenging Berchtold not to cross it. Yet the plan called for Berchtold to do precisely that 2 days later. The atmosphere around the Tsar signaled that there would be no retreat in the face of Austrian Germany. The ultimatum to Serbia had not yet been delivered, but the tone of the conversations already heralded the coming storm. On the morning of July 21st, Poincaré met the Tsar again at Peterhof. This time the meeting was longer and more private. For about an hour the two leaders spoke face to face. On the table was the strengthening of the Franco-Russian alliance and the assurance of mutual military preparations. That same evening, an important move took place behind the diplomatic stage. Foreign Minister Sazonov sent a sharp message to Berlin through the German ambassador, Portales. He warned that if Austria issued any kind of ultimatum to Serbia, Russia would regard it as a deliberate provocation. This warning revealed that Petersburg was shifting onto an increasingly determined line. Poincaré was unaware of this démarche at the time, but in the coming day he would observe firsthand the hardening stance of Russian circles. French attaché Louis de Robian would later note in his diary on July 22nd that nothing was spoken of except war. We were now speaking, albeit in veiled language, about a war that only days earlier no one had thought possible. The final day of the visit unfolded almost as a show of force. The French delegation, who had slept in tents in preparation for a military inspection, awoke to a grand display. This morning at Krasnoye Selo, inspection. 60,000 troops took part. A magnificent parade of power and majesty. Infantry marching to the strains of Marche de Sambre et Meuse and Marche Lorraine. How charged with associations was this military machine, set in motion by the Tsars of all the Russias, before the eyes of the Allied president, himself a son of Lorraine. Poincaré sat before the tent, beside the Empress. A few glances exchanged among us showed we shared the very same thoughts. While the French delegation prepared for departure, contacts between the two sides continued throughout the day. In the afternoon, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Viviani met with his Russian counterpart Sazonov. They agreed on instructions to be sent to the Russian and French embassies in Vienna. The ambassadors were to act jointly in urging Austria to show restraint, and to express the hope that Austria would refrain from doing anything that might offend Serbia's honor and independence. These carefully chosen words were meant to obstruct the path of the ultimatum that was about to be issued. British Ambassador George Buchanan confirmed that his government would send a similar message. Among the French, discussion also arose over how the meeting should be presented to the press. In Paleolog's draft communiqué, Serbia was hinted at only in the following words: "The two governments, where the balance of power in Europe is concerned, and particularly regarding the Balkans, have discovered that their views and interests are identical." but Viviani objected. "I think this involves us a bit too much in Russia's Balkan policy," the Prime Minister remarked, and ordered a new text. The visit of the President to the Emperor of Russia has allowed the two friendly and allied countries to discover that they are of one mind concerning the maintenance of the balance of power and peace in Europe, and especially in the Balkans. President Poincaré, however, was satisfied with the outcome of the visit. So long as Russia did not waver in its resolve, everything was proceeding according to plan. Poincaré called this a policy of peace, for in his eyes, Germany and Austria would back down when faced with such unyielding determination. And if they did not, they would be forced into war against mighty Russia, against France, and against Great Britain, the great power of land, sea, trade, and industry. Just before departure, Poincaré reminded the Tsar once more, "This time, we must not retreat." At the very moment when Poincaré was urging the Tsar to stand firm, Vienna had already dispatched its famous ultimatum to Belgrade. The tragic poker game had begun. In Vienna, the debates over the ultimatum that had dragged on for weeks were reaching their conclusion. On July 19th, the Council of Ministers met in Berchtold's office to discuss the draft of the ultimatum and the timing of its delivery. It was agreed that it would be presented on July 23rd at 5 o'clock in the evening. Later, this was postponed to 6, so that it would only reach its destination after Poincaré had departed. "It is unlikely that our move will be known before Poincaré leaves St. Petersburg," Berchtold remarked. Yet he was well aware that since word of Vienna's plans had already reached Rome, every hour was of great importance. The Serbian government would be given 48 hours to reply. If it did not accept every point in full, the ultimatum would expire on Saturday, July 25th. But what exactly would Austria demand of Serbia? 1. To suppress every publication inciting hatred or contempt of the monarchy, or whose general tendency was directed against its territorial integrity. 2. To proceed immediately with the dissolution of the Narodna Odbrana, to confiscate all its means of propaganda. 3. To remove without delay from public instruction in Serbia, whether from the teaching staff or the methods of teaching, everything that serves or might serve to foster propaganda against Austria-Hungary. 4. To dismiss from military and administrative service all officers and officials guilty of propaganda against Austria-Hungary. The imperial and royal government reserved the right to communicate the names of such individuals. 5. To accept the cooperation in Serbia of representatives of the imperial and royal government in suppressing subversive movements directed against the monarchy's territorial integrity. 6. To open a judicial inquiry against all participants in the plot of June 28th who were on Serbian territory. Organs of the imperial and royal government would take part in the investigations. 7. To arrest immediately Major Vojislav Tankasic and the Serbian official Milan Shiganovic, who had been implicated in the assassination plot. 8. To take effective measures to prevent the smuggling of arms and explosives across the frontier, to dismiss and punish severely those frontier officials at Shabak and Loznica who had assisted the perpetrators of the crime in crossing the border. 9. To furnish explanations regarding the unjustifiable statements made by Serbian officials. 10. To inform without delay the imperial and royal government of the execution of the measures included in the foregoing points. The imperial and royal government expects the reply of the royal government by Saturday, the 25th of this month, at 6 o'clock in the evening at the latest. On Thursday, July 23rd, when Baron Giesel requested an audience with Prime Minister Pašić to deliver the ultimatum, he was disappointed to learn that the Prime Minister was not even in the capital. He was in Niš campaigning for re-election. The Serbs knew what was coming. Almost the entire top leadership had scattered across the country, as if to flee from the ultimatum. The Austrians expected that as soon as Pašić read the text, he would resign, so as to avoid the dishonor of accepting it. Yet even if the government resigned, responsibility would still fall upon it until a new one was formed. The Austrians were unwilling to wait any longer. Shortly before 6 o'clock in the evening of July 23rd, Baron Giesel arrived at the Serbian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. By that time, Austria's ultimatum to Serbia was Europe's worst-kept secret. Only the Austrians and Germans had seen the full text. But just like the Russians, French, British, and Italians, the Serbs had no doubt that it was about to arrive and that its terms would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to accept. The only official available to receive, it was Finance Minister Dr. Lazar Paciu. Yet when the ambassador sought to hand over the document, he was met with an unpleasant surprise. The minister did not speak French. Clearly, this was one of Belgrade's tricks to delay the process. The note was translated by embassy staff and then conveyed to the minister. Baron Giesel stated that the deadline would expire on Saturday, July 25th, at 6 o'clock, and that if no satisfactory reply was received, he and his entire staff would leave Belgrade. The minister replied that such an important note could only be answered by a meeting of the cabinet, and that he could not accept it on his own. After a long and awkward silence, Giesel decided to leave the ultimatum on the table, telling Paciu that Serbia was free to act as it pleased. Then he rose and left the room. There was nothing more he could do. No sooner had Giesel departed the building than Minister Paciu dropped the pretense. He immediately shared the contents of the ultimatum with two fellow ministers who had been waiting in the adjoining room. They, in turn, hurried to pass the news on to the diplomats of friendly powers. Pandora's box had now been opened. On the morning of Friday, the 24th of July, having learned all the details, Sazonov shouted to his private secretary, "C'est la guerre européenne." This means a European war. Austrian envoy Shatter had gone to the foreign ministry to deliver the note to Sazonov. The Russian minister firmly and categorically rejected two of its provisions. He declared that the Serbs would never agree to the dissolution of the Narodna Odbrana, nor could they permit Austrian representatives to take part in the investigation of the Sarajevo assassination on Serbian soil. Shapari insisted that, in demanding the suppression of terrorist agitation against the dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary was merely acting in concert with all civilized states. But Sazonov gave a sharp reply, "This is wrong. You are setting Europe on fire. The impression which the note will create in Paris, in London, and perhaps elsewhere, is that of an unjustified act of aggression." After this heated exchange, Sazonov pressed the button that would set a vast mechanism in motion. He summoned the Council of Ministers and urgently notified Chief of Staff Yanushkevich and Naval Minister Grigorovich that their presence was required. He also ordered Yanushkevich to make all necessary preparations to place the army on a war footing and to have a plan for partial mobilization ready for discussion by 3 o'clock that afternoon. When Finance Minister Piotr Bach arrived at the Foreign Ministry for the meeting, he asked Sazonov's secretary whether there was a real chance of war. The reply came bluntly, "Sazonov considers war inevitable." "In that case," said Bach, "urgent steps must be taken to transfer the Russian treasury funds deposited in Berlin banks." He immediately ordered that 100 million rubles be moved to Paris and Petersburg. Before the council convened, Sazonov had already met with military officials to work on mobilization plans. This time, unlike in past crises, Russia would not pull back at the last moment. Seeking reassurance from his allies, Sazonov attended a luncheon with the French ambassador Paleolog and the British ambassador Buchanan. The French were already aligned with the Russians. Days of exchanges and prior intelligence had pointed toward this outcome. The British, however, remained hesitant. Sazonov asked the British envoy whether His Majesty's government intended to declare solidarity with France and Russia. Buchanan replied that he could give no such assurance, and then pressed Sazonov with a blunt question. If Austria-Hungary undertakes military action against Serbia, is Russia proposing to declare war? Sazonov evaded a direct answer, saying that no final decision had yet been taken before the council meeting. But there was no doubt about where he stood. Under his leadership, Russia was preparing in earnest for partial mobilization. Russia cannot remain a passive spectator while the Slavic people is deliberately trampled underfoot. In 1877, we fought Turkey for the liberation of the Balkan Slavs. We made immense sacrifices in pursuit of this goal. If Russia fails to fulfill her historic mission, she will be regarded as a fallen state and henceforth will rank second among the powers. At this critical turning point, if the Serbs are abandoned to their fate, Russian prestige in the Balkans will be utterly destroyed. The dizzying traffic of Petersburg continued at full speed. In the evening, Sazonov met with the Serbian envoy Spalajković. The envoy carried an important instruction from Prime Minister Pasic. He was to inform Sazonov that the Serbian army was in no position to resist an Austro-Hungarian attack and to ask what advice Russia would give Belgrade. Belgrade's stance was clear: the Serbian government would do whatever Russia advised. Sazonov gave the envoy a surprising recommendation. As a gesture of goodwill, he suggested that Serbia announce its acceptance of those provisions deemed less harmful. But he insisted that Belgrade must reject Articles 5 and 6, which violated Serbian sovereignty. In effect, the minister was openly advising the Serbs to allow the Austrians to enter their country without resistance. Yet the crucial details were delivered in private conversation. Sazonov assured the envoy that Serbia could count on Russian support. The message to Belgrade was unmistakable. The Serbs must neither yield nor appear submissive. If matters came to war, Russia would fight at their side. On the 25th of July, the Council of Ministers met under the presidency of Tsar Nicholas. The historic decisions taken that day went even further than those of Friday. The Tsar gave his approval, in principle, for partial mobilization, covering the Black Sea and Baltic fleets, along with 4 military districts: Kiev, Odessa, Moscow, and Kazan. Excluding the navy, a substantial force of 1.1 million men was to be readied for war. Most of the army was still dispersed at summer maneuvers and drills. All units were now ordered back to their permanent barracks, where weapons and supplies were stored. This measure would, beyond the 1.1 million men designated for partial mobilization, bring the empire's entire army rapidly to readiness. On Chief of Staff Yanukovych's orders, at 4:10 in the afternoon, secret telegram No. 1547 was prepared. Immediately prepare the transport plans and conditions for the return of all units to their permanent barracks. The time allotted for completion of this task is 24 hours. In terms of junior officers and NCOs, the Russian army lagged far behind its German counterpart. As a result, cadets from the military academies were promoted to officer rank at once. In addition, a state of war, meaning martial law, was declared in Moscow, Petersburg, and all fortress cities of European Russia. The Russian war machine had now begun to turn. The expiry of the ultimatum drew ever closer. Signals from Belgrade to Vienna remained ambiguous. On Saturday morning, Pasic had given the impression to foreign embassies that Serbia would comply with the ultimatum, subject only to minor reservations. But this soon proved false. The dissolution of the Narodna Odbrana was flatly rejected, as was the demand for Austrian participation in the investigation. What had changed between morning and evening? The only change was Spalajković's report sent from Petersburg to Prime Minister Pasic. Sazonov's full backing, his assurance that the Russian war machine stood entirely behind Serbia, altered Pasic's stance. The consequences were obvious. On Saturday, the 25th of July, at 3 in the afternoon, the Serbian government secretly ordered mobilization against Austria-Hungary. Near 6 o'clock that evening, Prime Minister Pasic went to the Austrian embassy. Handing the note to Envoy Baron Giesel, he said, "Some of your demands have been accepted. For the rest, we place our hope in your loyalty and sense of honor as an Austrian officer." Giselle skimmed the reply. at once, he judged that Serbia had failed to comply unconditionally within the 48 hours allotted. Having received the reply at 6 minutes to 6, the envoy crossed the Austro-Serbian border just 45 minutes later. Immediately upon crossing, he telegraphed Vienna with the news. The diplomatic curtain of the dangerous dance had now fallen. In Budapest, Prime Minister Tissa, and in Vienna, Berchtold, received the momentous news before 7 o'clock. Yet despite these decisive steps, Vienna still hesitated. In recent days, Berchtold had sought to calm British opinion by implying that rejection of the ultimatum need not automatically mean war. On Friday, while the ultimatum still ran its course, he had told Russian chargé d'affaires, Prince Kudyshev, "The direct consequence of a rejection will be the departure of our minister and the embassy staff." Kudyshev was unconvinced and retorted with a phrase often heard in those days, "Then that means war." Even Conrad, though pressing for speed, framed his orders on Saturday night so that actual mobilization against Serbia would begin only on Tuesday, the 28th of July. Behind this delay lay a lingering hope that Belgrade might yet retreat at the last moment. But Serbia's mobilization had already begun that very Saturday. In any case, Conrad's war plans, Plan B and Plan R, were largely ready, in contrast to Russia's Plan 19. If there was no Russian intervention, only Plan B would be put into effect for the time being. Amid all these events, the British maintained their silence for a long time. The island had troubles of its own. For much of the July crisis, the attention of statesmen in London was fixed on Northern Ireland. The Home Rule Act, passed in May, had caused major controversy. Deprived of a solution that met their demands, both Catholic Irish nationalists and Protestant unionists had begun preparing for armed struggle. By spring, Ireland stood on the brink of a major conflict. When the Sarajevo incident erupted, the British government's mind was still preoccupied with Ulster. The Franz Ferdinand affair had not even drawn the attention of Prime Minister Asquith. His thoughts were entirely absorbed by the extraordinary things happening in Ulster. For Edward Grey, however, it was different. From the very first moment, he sensed the depth of the crisis. After reading the contents of Austria's note to Belgrade, Grey summoned Austrian ambassador Count Mensdorf on the 24th of July. He acknowledged Austria's concerns over the involvement of certain Serbian officials and admitted that some of the demands in the note were justified. Having secured cabinet approval, Grey proposed that the four powers not directly involved, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, should intervene if conflict broke out between Russia and Austria. Grey himself had no desire to be drawn into war, nor did public opinion. Almost no major newspaper supported the idea of Britain entering a war. In the final days of the crisis, the Daily News would write of the deep unease at the thought of British soldiers' lives being sacrificed merely so that the Russians might dominate the Slav world. Britain acted as though, a week later, it would not be drawn into the war at all. As the reverberations of the ultimatum echoed across the continent, decision-makers themselves grew uneasy. Despite the rising tension, Wilhelm still believed it was possible to avert a general crisis. When presented with a copy of the ultimatum to Belgrade, he remarked, "It is in fact a rather severe note." Like his entourage, the Kaiser believed Austria would ultimately refrain from war against Serbia. When Admiral Müller suggested that the ultimatum meant war was imminent, the Kaiser contradicted him. Wilhelm was not psychologically prepared for war. At the very hint of conflict, he would fall into panic. On the 27th of July, upon returning from holiday to Berlin, Wilhelm read Serbia's reply to the note. A remarkable result for 48 hours. This is more than we could have expected, but it removes any need for war. He was astonished to hear that, despite this, Austria had declared partial mobilization. In their place, I would never have proclaimed mobilization on that basis, he said. That same morning, at 10 o'clock, the Kaiser sent a letter to Foreign Minister Jago declaring that, since Serbia had yielded to the most humiliating kind of coercion, there was now no need to fight. A deep rift had opened in Germany's decision-making. The Kaiser's views clashed with those of his leading statesmen. While officials pressed Vienna to act quickly, Wilhelm was ready to pull back. The split was so great that the Kaiser's letter to Jago was simply ignored by the minister. The political leadership believed it was no longer possible to change course. Even Bethmann Hollweg warned the Kaiser that there could be no turning back. Yet he presented Wilhelm with a new idea on the 27th of July. He suggested the Kaiser send a telegram to Tsar Nicholas, assuring him that the German government would do everything possible to secure a satisfactory settlement between Vienna and Petersburg. Wilhelm rejected the proposal as ill-timed. Meanwhile, the news from abroad was anything but encouraging. Since the 25th of July, military activity in Russia had risen to an extraordinary level. From the border towns, dozens of reports flooded into Berlin. From the 24th of July onward, London too had entered the fray with threatening language, making it increasingly clear that in the event of war it would stand against Germany. At the German General Staff, an intelligence evaluation board was convened to sift through the information coming in from agents on both sides. On the afternoon of the 28th of July, the board issued its assessment based on the latest reports. It appears that Russia is in partial mobilization. The scope is not yet known. The Odessa and Kiev military districts are certain. Warsaw is not yet confirmed. In other districts, particularly Vilna, mobilization orders have not yet been issued. Still, it is certain that Russia has taken military measures along the German frontier that can be interpreted as preparations for war. Most likely, the period of preparation for war now applies to the entire empire. Frontier guards, fully armed and ready for action, are everywhere. Pens were swiftly giving way to swords. At 11 a.m. on the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary issued the long-expected declaration of war against Serbia. When Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg learned of Austria's action, he once again found himself humiliated by his furious sovereign. On Tuesday afternoon, when Kaiser Wilhelm received the news, he exploded with rage. "You've landed me in quite a mess," he snapped at Bethmann, and ordered him to press Vienna to enter negotiations with Russia, even if, to save the honor of the Austrian army, it required the occupation of Belgrade. Yet the Germans faced an even greater problem. Conrad von Hötzendorf informed Berlin that active military operations against Serbia could not begin until the 12th of August. In other words, Vienna would be unable to launch a major offensive for nearly 2 weeks. Berlin felt it had been played by Vienna. Determined to reshape the character of the coming war, the Kaiser moved quickly. He demanded that Vienna begin talks with St. Petersburg and give Sazonov the clearest possible assurance. "We are far removed from any idea of territorial gain in Serbia, and our military measures are aimed only at temporarily occupying Belgrade and certain other points in Serbian territory in order to compel the Serbian government to meet Austria's demands. Once these demands are met, evacuation will follow." This move, later known as the Halt in Belgrade proposal, revealed a serious division. Kaiser Wilhelm was more inclined toward a compromise. Bethmann Hollweg, however, intended to wait for concessions from St. Petersburg. By demanding concessions from Russia rather than offering them himself, and by avoiding any warning that Germany would respond to Russia's secret mobilization, Bethmann weakened his own leverage. The Kaiser's Halt in Belgrade initiative was not even passed to Vienna until midday on the 28th of July, by which time the first guns had already opened fire, and then only on Bethmann's orders. Meanwhile, London offered to mediate in hopes of lowering tensions and preventing a real war from breaking out. Events, however, were slipping completely out of control. After all these developments, the Kaiser accepted, within just 24 hours, the very plan of telegraphic diplomacy he had rejected on the 27th of July when first proposed by the Chancellor. Nor was this panic confined to Berlin. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas likewise dictated a telegram to the Kaiser, hoping to defuse the crisis. Both monarchs, frightened once the possibility of real war loomed before them, were now attempting to retreat after weeks of threatening to press the button, and even after pressing it. As the first shots echoed, these two rulers, who had threatened each other with war now, busied themselves drafting telegrams. "I'm glad you are back. In this serious moment, I appeal to you to help me. An ignoble war has been declared to a weak country. The indignation in Russia shared fully by me is enormous. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war, to try and avoid such a calamity as a European war. I beg you, in the name of our old friendship, to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. I have heard with the deepest concern of the impression produced in your country by Austria's action against Serbia. The unscrupulous agitation that has been going on in Serbia for years has led to the frightful crime of which Archduke Franz Ferdinand has been the victim. The spirit that led to the murder of one's own king and queen still dominates this country. In this case, politics plays no part. On the other hand, I fully understand how difficult it is for you and your government to face public opinion. I confidently hope you will help me to smooth over difficulties that may yet arise. Your very sincere and devoted friend and cousin, Willie." Thanks for your telegram, conciliatory and friendly. Whereas official message presented today by your ambassador to my minister was conveyed in a very different tone. Beg you to explain this divergency. It would be right to give over the Austro-Serbian problem to the Hague Conference. Best thanks for telegram. It is quite out of the question that my ambassador's language could have been in contradiction with the tenor of my telegram. Count Portales was instructed to draw the attention of your government to the danger and grave consequences involved by a mobilization. Russia mobilizes against Austria, my role as mediator you kindly entrusted me with, and which I accepted at your express prayer, will be endangered if not ruined. The whole weight of the decision lies solely on your shoulders now, who have to bear the responsibility for peace or war. I thank you heartily for your mediation, which begins to give one hope that all may yet end peacefully. It is technically impossible to stop our military preparations, which were obligatory owing to Austria's mobilization. We are far from wishing war. As long as the negotiations with Austria on Serbia's account are taking place, my troops shall not make any provocative action. I give you my solemn word for this. I put all my trust in God's mercy and hope in your successful mediation in Vienna for the welfare of our countries and for the peace of Europe. I yesterday pointed out to your government the way by which a lone war may be avoided. Although I requested an answer for noon today, no telegram from my ambassador conveying an answer from your government has reached me as yet. I therefore have been obliged to mobilize my army. Immediate, affirmative, clear, and unmistakable answer from your government is the only way to avoid endless misery. Until I have received this answer, alas, I am unable to discuss the subject of your telegram. As a matter of fact, I must request you to immediately order your troops on no account to commit the slightest act of trespassing over our frontiers. They clearly felt the heavy burden of responsibility for unleashing a war that would certainly lead to the deaths of thousands, perhaps millions, of their subjects. With the spectre of such a conflict looming ever larger, Willie and Nicky clutched desperately at any possible escape. If their practical authority as monarchs had been as absolute as it appeared on paper, they might have succeeded. But they could not. They lacked the power. After Austria's declaration of war on Serbia, and buoyed by Paleolog's assurance of France's unconditional support, Sazonov pushed Russia's war preparations ahead with determination. Even as Wilhelm and Nicholas exchanged their peace telegrams, Russia had already entered the countdown to a European war. The Austrian noose around Germany's neck was now fully drawn tight. The war they had tried to avert began with the first shots fired at 1 a.m. on the 29th of July. In response to Serbian engineers blowing up the railway bridge across the River Sava that linked the two countries, the Austro-Hungarian monitor SMS Bodrog opened fire on Belgrade. The war that would later be called World War I had begun.